Good evening, and thank you very much indeed for joining the channel. My name is Jim Ferguson. I've got a wonderful guest here tonight. His name is Godfrey Bloom. He is an author, a former member of the European Parliament. He was a NATO officer with the 4th Armoured Brigade, and also a very successful hedge fund manager as well. Good evening, Godfrey. It's lovely to see you. How are you?
I'm good. Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me. I just like to tell everybody that I've had some dental work this afternoon at 3 o'clock. I have not been on the booze all afternoon, even if my left-hand side of my face collapses. That's it. So that's my excuse.
Well, I think that's a very good excuse. No, I appreciate that, Godfrey, and I wouldn't have thought that anyway. But it's lovely to have you here. We've followed each other for some time now. We're going to put the links up to your website, to your Twitter channel, and also to a very popular YouTube channel, I think, that you have there as well. So we'll get all of those links put up once it's gone to editing. But you actually studied at the Royal College for Defence Studies, didn't you, way back in the day?
Yes, I did. So I've got a number of strings to my bow. That's not because I'm clever, that's because I'm old. So the older you get, the more stuff you've done. So I have a sort of a dual career, as it were. Once was in the city, and just as a minor correction, I was not a hedge fund manager. I was a fund manager specializing in fixed interest for pensions. I wish I had been a fund manager. I'd be a lot richer. So I was doing the unfashionable side of pension management. And the other side, of course, was a very undistinguished military career, I have to tell you, extremely undistinguished. But it did give me an insight into the military, certainly in NATO. And also, I was fortunate enough to do two things. I did the Sandhurst Russian Studies course under Professor Chris Donnelly, and also, as you say, the Royal College of Defence Studies. So I've also had the privilege of lecturing as well. And so I'm particularly interested in, war and its absurdities.
Well, I'm going to come on to some things about the war, and I would like to discuss a little bit about Ukraine. It's an issue that's important, and it's certainly developing. And I want to get your thoughts and opinions on some of these things just now, especially the fact that you're a peace campaigner. I think that's very interesting. But there is one thing, Godfrey, that I personally feel that's not really getting the attention that it deserves. And at the moment here in the UK, we have a massive problem with excess deaths. There's thousands of people dying every single week here in the United Kingdom, and it doesn't look like the government want to deal with it. They don't want to talk about it. Do you have any thoughts on that at the moment?
Well, I do. My last job, funnily enough, in the City of London, I worked for the City of London for 40 years. My actual last job before I went into private consultancy work was the chief executive of a life assurance company. So I am trained in the interpretation of mortality statistics and health statistics in that field. I worked obviously with an actuarial team which reported to me, so we could look at life expectancy, so on and so forth. And what we're seeing now is the most extraordinary phenomenon, which is unprecedented. And that is, I was in the city further down the food chain than just managing funds, but you have to sort of take everything into consideration when you're managing pension funds, and life expectancy is one of them, and life assurance. And one of the things that came in many years ago was rating for smokers. So if you were a smoker, life assurance companies rated you a little bit, and I think it was 3 or 4% above an ordinary life. And that was based on a very tiny statistic. That was a tiny blip in the life expectancy statistics, which were measured by a company called Stone and Cox. And you could look up your life expectancy, you could work all this out from an actuarial perspective. And that was really quite a minor blip. What we are seeing now is colossal from an actuarial perspective, huge. The excess deaths, and if I just quickly explain that maybe for your subscribers, every year, roughly speaking, in the Great Britain, 500,000 people die of anything, road accidents, heart attacks, the lot. That's the number of people who fall off their perch every year. And so you can, generally speaking, guess how many is going to do it when you're making life insurance or pension arrangements from a professional perspective. And what we have now is somewhere in the region with excess deaths, of in the region of maybe 560,000 because of the excess deaths. So we're getting thousands and thousands of excess deaths, which we wouldn't normally have. Now, there's another twist to the story, and that is they're in the most unlikely category. So there's something called group life, which life insurance companies sell mainly to FTSE companies, or mainly to FTSE 250 companies. So you get 4 times death in service life cover. It comes up with the rations, Jim. You know, it comes up with the rations because you are selected as a Class A life. So you're going to be in between the age of 25, probably, and 45 for a group life. That's when you've joined your company. You've probably had a medical, but not always. But certainly you have to be medically fit. Otherwise, they wouldn't have given you the job. What we're saying, and that was a very exceptional Class A life. So your life expectancy was well above the average. What we're seeing now, and this came out with Lincoln Assurance in the United States, that group now is getting a higher death expectancy of people who are ordinary off the street. So we would call them the man in the Clapham omnibus. The Americans would call them Joe Sixpack. This is totally and utterly unprecedented because these younger people, these young men, have been bullied or coerced into taking medication, and there is therefore a case, an actuarial case, which is looking at the moment at what that reason can be. And at the moment, politicians, bureaucrats, big pharma, the NHS, and even the National British Heart Foundation, of which I used to be a sponsor in an earlier professional life. What is absolutely fascinating, that everybody's pretending that somehow it's just an extraordinary coincidence and nobody can put their finger on it. And there's only one man that put his head above the parapet in Parliament, of course, and we all know that was Andrew Bridgen. And all he did was say, I think we ought to have an investigation. I think we ought to have an inquiry. He was immediately vilified, viciously vilified, and sacked. So that tells me, and you'll know as an experienced fellow in these fields as well, that we know there's something to hide. Otherwise, why wouldn't they say this is not an issue, this is no problem? Yes, we are getting some unusual statistics and we ought to investigate it. You do not crush any form of dissent, unless, of course, you've read the book on propaganda by Dr. Joseph Goebbels, and that's exactly what's happening. Dissent is verboten. And sooner or later, this will have to come out. And it's not just people in group life insurance companies and FTSE companies, of course. It's athletes. It's football players, basketball players, tennis players, rugby players. In the prime of life, suddenly falling over with no explanation. So we must have an inquiry. It must be looked into, and it must be looked in by some form of independent and expertise body.
Yes, well, thank you very much indeed, Godfrey. I mean, that's a very, very good summation of where we're at with it. And of course, you're absolutely right with Andrew Bridgen. He, incredibly brave man. He sacrificed his career and you know, all of the things that went on there with him. He was genuinely trying to stand up and do the right thing, not just for his own constituents, but indeed for the country and indeed all the people around the world who are being affected by this. I had the pleasure of speaking with a doctor in Canada. His name is Dr. Chris Shoemaker, and that came about from a very brief video that he put out. It was only about 90 seconds long, but he explained in the interview that he did with me just a day or two ago, where he said that he had been looking at American military data and data also from Thailand, and that people who had taken the and who had been involved in some clinical studies after that, went on to find that sometimes they had discovered, although they had no symptoms, they were actually suffering from myocarditis, which is, in layman's terms, inflammation of the heart and heart damage. They didn't realize they had it. And it turns out that he has explained, and this isn't his own view, this is just a medical fact, that 50% of people that go on to develop myocarditis, and I'm not a healthcare professional either, I'm only reporting what he's told me, but 50% of those that go on to develop myocarditis will die within 5 years. And the other very concerning statistic was that the average of the number of people was 20% who went on to develop it. Now, the incredible thing here is that the data that he was explaining was that only 1 in 1 million people are usually unfortunate enough to suffer from myocarditis. But the data is now being verified at 200,000 per million who are suffering from myocarditis. And of that 200,000, 50% of them will die within 5 years. And that he stated it again. When I interviewed him, he said that is a medical fact. That is extremely concerning. And with your experience, Godfrey, do you have you or are you aware of any kind of pushback from insurance companies for those people who may have various different products with them, life insurance policies, critical illness cover, that type of thing? Is there any evidence that they have, or taking note or are taking note of the fact that people may have? And is that a factor for new policies, if you happen to be aware of that?
Well, the critical illness policies were withdrawn actually pre-COVID because it was so difficult to actually underwrite it. So you get somebody, you could get a lady with, say, breast cancer, who would be in her 45. She might be 45 years old. And under the old system, of course, she had £100,000 worth of life cover. Under that policy, she would be paid out immediately. And her life expectancy could be another 20 or 25 years. So it wasn't a policy that you could make a profit on. The highly profitable stuff, was, I say, was group life, because insurance companies want Class A lives, so they don't have to pay out. Insurance companies about getting premiums in and not actually paying out. That's the name of the game. And so what is interesting, there's some interesting phenomena because this is going on in Australia, it's going on in North America, it's going on in Western Europe, where we know that the actuarial profession per se, so the Association, say, of American or Australian Actuaries, they know this has happened because this is their job to do. Now, at the moment, they haven't withdrawn certain life assurance packages because what I suspect they would do, and if I was chief executive of a life assurance company, what I would do, I would simply make the company grotesquely uncompetitive rather than go public and saying we're withdrawing that, which brings you into immediate confrontation, as Andrew Bridges have found out, with the bureaucracy, the politicians, the regulators, everybody. So if you don't want to go down that route, which is an expensive way of doing it, you write yourself out of the market by making your rates absurd. Now, of course, what will happen is nobody will underwrite it eventually. So this is probably what will happen. And I suspect because the Institute of Actuaries globally will not put their head above the parapet, certainly as yet, they won't put their head above the parapet. But what they do is they'll quietly withdraw from the market. No names, no pack drill. That's my hypothesis with my experience. But we must remember, we have to remember that I finished my career as a life assurance chief executive in 1991. So obviously I'm 30 years out of date. The principles, however, don't change. The principles of underwriting and broking an assessment and actuarial statistics don't really change. So
Mm-hmm.
it'll be interesting to say sooner or later they'll have to break cover or just slightly slide out of the market. It'll be interesting to see. It'll be the same as insurance companies loading for climate change, for example. What's happened hitherto is if or whoever you may be in the insurance market, you know, fire, auto, marine, and all the rest of it, you suggest that you have to put your premiums up by 10% to take into consideration global warming.
Mm-hmm.
But of course, they did that 30 years ago. And if you look at the real statistics, not the hysteria and the propaganda, you will find there has been no global warming. Very embarrassing for everybody who's linked themselves to this, which are mainly, of course, Hollywood celebrities, royals, and we Swedish pixies from Sweden, you know. And all the dissent from proper scientists like Professor Ian Plimer and hundreds of others, of course, don't get on the screen because, again, dissent is verboten. So we will have to see how that develops. But I think sooner or later, the market finds its place. Yes. If the market is XYZ, you will find that the market will respond to XYZ because they don't stay in business. You can't run an institutional company on fake science, hysteria, political stuff, as some of the banks, of course, are now finding out now.
That's funny you mentioned that, because
don't go down that rabbit hole. But I'm afraid that's the long and short of it. And it was me. I haven't had any credit for it, but there we are. I wouldn't have expected. I actually coined the phrase "go woke, go broke." That was mine, and it first popped up about 6 months ago, and everybody's using it now, but it was mine.
I confess, I have used it before, but full credit to you.
Good.
I mean, there's so much to talk about, and obviously we do have a limited time. There are other subjects that I want to discuss with you because, with your experience, I've very much been looking forward to you coming on. It's been booked for a little while now, and you've got an excellent colleague, Patrick. I'll pay tribute to him. But I think, yeah. But I mean, there is so much that is happening, and unfortunately, it's quite dark, some of the things that we talk about on this channel. You know, it's just what it is, you know. Let's talk a little bit about Ukraine, shall we? Because that's a situation that, you know, you're a former military man, but you're also a man of peace. You understand the horrors of war. Do you think that we're going to see further escalation there, or do you think that that cooler heads may prevail?
Well, there's no sign at the moment of cooler heads in Washington. Washington is the problem. The Russian Federation and Putin are basically saying for some time, let's do a deal. You know, let's do a deal. You know, this war is unnecessary. Let's sit down and get around a table and see if we can do that. The reason that we're not allowed to see Russia today, and you can't get Russia today in Great Britain, is because they don't want you to see the speeches Putin has made in the past about cutting a deal and sitting around a table. We've also got to look, have we not, and most people don't know this because all they get is mainstream media. Most people do not understand how the war started and when it started. It didn't start a couple of years ago. It started in 2014 when the CIA changed the regime in the Ukraine. They then pumped up the military in the Ukraine to the one of the biggest armies in NATO, 400,000, which is enormous when you consider the British Army is 80,000. Enormous, and they trained it and they pumped it up with the latest weapons. And I wrote an article on this in 2016, saying no good would come of this. Things were going to go wrong if we didn't pay attention to what we're doing, because we're poking the bear. No good ever comes of this. So that was one of the main problems that we had. But of course, what we know now, which you've known for several years actually, but not specifically in 2016, that the Washington concept with NATO as a cat's paw was regime change in Moscow. They wanted regime change in Moscow, and they thought it was going to be easier than it actually was. So what they did, they provoked the bear, poked the bear, by actually using their militia artillery attacks on the eastern Donbass to kill Russian-speaking ethnic Russian civilians to the tune of about 14,000, to goad Russia into coming in and sealing off the Russian-speaking bit of the eastern Ukraine, which is what they did with relatively few people, about 120,000. They cut it out to protect the ethnic Russians. And of course, they thought that this would bring NATO to the table and start talking some sense, and let's start talking peace. But of course, if you remember when Liz Truss went out, when she was foreign secretary, she went out to see Putin and came back. And Putin actually said, before he was cut off by our satellite interference, he said she just wasn't listening. She just wasn't listening. Now, she wasn't listening. Now, bless her cotton socks, she should really be at home looking after the children or whatever she does. She shouldn't be really trying to do high stuff, high intellectual foreign policy with a man like Putin, grotesquely out of her depth. And then, of course, we saw Angela Merkel admit that the Minsk agreement, which was no further expansion of NATO and this, that, and the other, was just an opportunity to further build up the Ukrainian force, and that was a problem. And then we saw the infamous letter by the NATO secretary, Jens Stoltenberg, and I would have him arraigned and imprisoned because he was the trigger point for the war. When the Russian Federation said, we will not under any circumstances tolerate Ukraine membership of NATO, it must be neutral. We will not have American troops and missiles 800 miles from Moscow. We're not going to allow that. Please take us seriously. Jens Stoltenberg, and the letters, it's not a conspiracy theory. I mean, you could Google it up. Jens Stoltenberg said, it's none of your business if the Ukraine join NATO. We will do what we like, when we like, and how we like. And of course, then the Russian Federation said, this is ridiculous. We can't negotiate. With whom would we negotiate? They've admitted they've been lying. So what we'll have to do, we'll have to mobilize our reserves, build up our artillery base and supplies, so on and so forth, retreat backwards so that we can hold a line until we've done this, which is exactly what they did. This is old style Russian forces dogma, of which I do know something. They don't hold ground. They're not interested in holding ground, Jim. They're not interested in holding villages or towns. Their job, the Russian doctrine has always been to destroy the enemy army before you do anything else. Then you do anything else virtually without, without the encumbering baggage that you get. That's exactly what they're doing. They've destroyed the Ukrainian army, the first army, they've destroyed the second. The third is now very ramshackle, short of everything. And it's only a matter of time before the white flag goes up. Now, what happens after that, I couldn't say.
I mean, that's a very accurate assessment. I followed it since 2014 as well, when Victoria Nuland went across with Senators McCain, Lindsey Graham and others all stirring it all up. You could see what was happening back then. But you're quite correct. When Angela Merkel said, as well as Francois Hollande of France, had both admitted that the Minsk agreements were just a sham. It was only an opportunity to give the Kiev forces a chance to build up and re-attack the east and the Luhansk and the Donetsk areas. I mean, how could anybody take anything that they were going to agree to again seriously? They just wouldn't. We've got about another 5, 6, 7 minutes maybe. I want to touch on an organization that I consider to be fairly benign and unimportant some time ago, until their German chairman said that they were very proud of the fact that they had penetrated the cabinets of the world, or at least the Western Hemisphere, namely Klaus Schwab of the World Economic Forum. My view of him and his organization has significantly changed, having seen his placemen put in place being Joe Biden, as well as others there, John Kerry, Justin Trudeau, Freeland in the deputy of Trudeau, Christia. We've got Sunak, we've got Hunt, we've got Penny Mordaunt in the UK, as well as others, Emmanuel Macron in France, Mark Rutte in Holland. I mean, the list goes on and on. These are all paid up, signed up devotees of Klaus Schwab. Do you have any opinion as to the dangers that this organization actually poses? or perhaps you don't agree that they are a threat. What do you think, Godfrey?
Well, they have this rather maniacal, if you will, goal of a globalist society, run, of course, by themselves. And of course, there are some names you left off. I don't know whether you were just being diplomatic, but of course, we've got to also name the current Prince of Wales, King Charles III, and the Archbishop of Canterbury, who are totally upfront about being WEF sponsored. Now, I'm not quite sure who is the head honcho, whether it's Klaus Schwab or King Charles III. And if you look at some of the pictures, Charles III was hobnobbing with Klaus Schwab as a very young man, So he's been involved with this for some time. And of course, we have this situation, which is certainly in the Western industrial democracies and Australasia, they are all, yes, the WF placemen. And the thing is, it isn't a conspiracy theory. It is totally upfront. This isn't a secret. They are quite open, and you can Google up, his speeches, Klaus Schwab's speeches, and the Prince of Wales when he was the Prince of Wales, Prince Charles, Prince of Wales, and they were quite upfront about it. Now, here's the interesting phenomenon. And of course, you have to degrade your society. You have to degrade your society if you want the Great Reset or build back better. This is why mass immigration in Great Britain and Europe, where our ships, the border patrols, go halfway across, they pick them up, our lifeboats go across and pick them up, bring them in en masse every day and put them in 4-star, 3-star, 4 hotels with 3 meals a day and medical treatment. So this isn't an accident. A lot of people think it's incompetence or stupidity or whatever. No, they are being brought about in very large numbers. The same is happening in Ireland. And of course, what they're trying to do is degrade the society so they can then get through what they want to build, which of course is mass ID, WHO, vaccination ID, when people will actually say, gosh, let's have it because we don't know who the hell's in the country. Let's line them all up and find out who's what, including ourselves. And so we've seen what's happening in France now. France is virtually, dreadful. What's going on in France and Ireland, which doesn't get an awful lot of mainstream media coverage. And of course, the people we've brought in are only at the beginning of degrading society with violent crime and all the rest of it that's going on in the big cities. It's mainly a big city phenomenon. That's only just beginning here, but of course, they're well into this in France. Now, here's the interesting thing. When we hear, and Her Majesty said just before she died last year, 18 months ago, on this global warming business, which is the platform. If we don't accept this, we're all going to die, the world's going to boil. So we're talking about fake science here, massive fake science. And Her Majesty, who was then a very old lady, had obviously sort of been got at by her son and the bureaucrats and the politicians, so on and so forth. And she said, you might remember her saying this, we're going to have to change the way we do things. Now, of course, Jim, she didn't mean her. She meant you and me. So King Charles, who's advocating this, who's go down on record, who can Google it up, who wants a military style situation because we're all going to boil to death. But of course, he doesn't mean him. Balmoral, Windsor Castle, Buckingham Palace, Highgrove, the King's Flight, his cars. He's not going to give up anything. And he's certainly not going to give up food that he grows on his own estates and all the rest of it. We will be eating bugs. We are supposed to eat interest, but he doesn't mean him. And I was sitting in the Parliament building a few years ago, and he came to give one of his sort of rather ludicrous, bizarre speeches on how the world was going to boil. And he was going to do all this, but we were told that no questions, no interruptions, no nothing. He could give his spiel and disappear without a single question asked. So he's not open to any form of dissent or debate or anything like this. And he said, did he not, Jim, just a few months ago, without any sense of irony, I've been banging on about this for nearly 30 years. Were his own words, climate change and global boiling. And of course, nobody popped up and said, yes, you have for 30 years. When's it going to happen? 30 years we've had to listen to your drivel. And it's not happening. And yet we've got to have net zero. We can't go on holiday. We can't drive our cars. I'm afraid to say that, and I speak as a monarchist, somebody who held the Queen's Commission. My father held the Queen's Commission. We have a very, very evil or stupid man as our monarch.
Well, I mean, when you look at what's going on, Godfrey, and I appreciate your insight, and once again, you're absolutely accurate in everything you've stated there. We're talking about 15-minute cities where people will not be allowed to move out of their districts, and that's what they're actually calling them, districts. Akin to the Hunger Games, it's a film about a dystopian future where everybody's controlled. We're talking about CBDC, central bank digital currencies. It's deeply concerning. What I've been doing over the last few weeks and months is I've been engaging with people at the international level. I've been having meetings by Zoom call, and some of those people have gone on to be on the channel. And I honestly believe that what we're witnessing is truly frightening, but it's a global threat. And every nation state, every national state that is independent is considered to be an enemy to globalism and the globalist agenda. And you're right to say they are using mass immigration to weaken these individual sovereign nations. I think that we need to meet them. I think we need to meet them peacefully. I think we need to organize, and I believe that it will require, because it's a global threat, I believe it will require a truly global response from people in Canada, the United States, Australia, New Zealand, France, Holland, other parts of Europe, and the UK. We are going to have to start to pool our resources together, because it's quite clear they are not making any secret of it. This is what they intend to do to us. But you're right, they won't be eating the bugs. It's you and I that they'll be expecting to eat the bugs while they jet about in their jets, whilst they ban our vehicles and everything else. It's deeply concerning. In the last couple of minutes, Godfrey, because I could talk with you all night. It's an absolute pleasure to talk to you, and your depth of knowledge is fantastic. But in the last couple of minutes, because we have to wrap it up now, what would you like to say? What would you like to say? The floor is entirely yours.
I think the one thing I would say is that we need 20% of us, your subscribers, my subscribers, we're preaching always to the choir, Jim. 80% of the population simply have closed their ears. They're not interested. And it doesn't matter what you say to people, they cannot understand it. They won't join the dots. And this is going back to Joseph Goebbels again. The propaganda is absolutely incessant. So you have appeal. This is his pillars of propaganda. You must appeal to emotion. Fact is useless. You appeal to emotion. Dissent is absolutely verboten. You cannot, under any circumstances, allow dissent. Dissent doesn't work. And these are the two main pillars of propaganda. And so we've got to understand propaganda when we see it. We've also got to challenge. When your children come home and say the world's going to boil, and the end of the world and all this kind of thing, you have to help them find the information from scientists, and I edit one of those on my webpage, that these are the charts. They're easy to read, to actually prove that this is fake science, and go back to your school or go to your school on PTA and say, you're teaching my children fake science. And so it's a long haul to get people wired in. And I thought, when I was at the beginning with Brexit, I thought it was a lost cause, but I felt it was my duty to have a go. It took a long time, and we got a rotten deal, and we were betrayed all over the place, but we did vote for Brexit because eventually people knew they'd been had. And that will come, but it may not come in time because it's such a long lead in. One thing I would say, because people like to know what the doing thing is, don't they? What's the doing thing? It's all very well Mr. Bloom saying this or Jim Ferguson saying this. What can we do? The first thing you can do, and you can do it in the morning, is cancel your banker's order to the BBC. Step number one. So it makes you feel better, and let them sort it out. and don't worry about it because they're all crooks and spivs. Just cancel it. And if we all did that, it sends a message to the government and a globalism propaganda machine, which is one of the biggest in the world, and that's where we could start. It's a start point.
Well, I think that's a fantastic way to look at ending the broadcast. You are a leading light, Godfrey. There's no doubt about it. I've always followed your channel, and I would encourage everybody that's out there to follow Godfrey Bloom. He really calls it like it is. He has an amazing website, fantastic resources there. You must educate yourself. But can I just say to all the people out there, once again, I thank you for your help, your assistance, and I'm grateful. And I would appreciate it if you will continue to do what you're doing. And my sincere thanks to everybody that does that. And to you also, Godfrey, thank you so much indeed. I'd love to have you back on the channel. Do you think that's something you might be able to do?
I'd love to, and it's an honor to be invited on to start with. So thank you very much.
My pleasure, Godfrey. All right. Well, this is Jim Ferguson. It's been a pleasure to talk to you and to you as well, Godfrey. We'll talk soon. Thank you and good night.
As most of you know, my work is very heavily independently research based, and I get my information from all over the world. It would help if you press the subscribe button and the little bell next to it, because the more subscribers I have, the more likely it is that international independent research institutes will share their material with me. It's most helpful, and then of course I automatically share it with you. So surprise won't cost you anything. Thank you very much.